Thanks, Mitch, and we're really enjoying this platform, Shindig, as a way to bring you this webinar today. And welcome to our home. We live in Escondido, California, near California State University, San Marcos. Randy and I are delighted to be with you today. We're talking about the title of the webinar is the how-tos of cultural proficiency. And we've designed some participant outcomes for you today, and these are really the participant outcomes. You'll see them on the first slide here. The participant outcomes that we usually design for the sessions when we work with schools, with districts, and organizations on their journey toward cultural proficiency. Our participants learn about 4 fundamental tools. These are tools for change within the context of today's schools, the complexity of today's educational environment. Participants will see, you'll see your role in narrowing and closing the access and educational gaps. You'll become familiar with appropriate use of the Cultural Proficiency Library, the books and the e-courses that Mitch was talking about, and you'll deepen your understanding that leads to actions as leverage points for personal and organizational change. And this is what we'll talk about as we move through the webinar today, some how-tos or moving toward action for your journey toward change through the lens of cultural proficiency.
On the next slide, Terry Cross will be introduced to us. When Kakanza and Ray and I started the first book, one of the things that we were looking for was a delivery system for addressing issues of inequity in our country. And we had looked at lots of different models. And about 1987, we discovered Terry Cross's work. We never do a presentation or a professional writing where we don't thank him, because he and his colleagues were the ones that were the originators of this concept. Terry's a member of the Seneca Nation. He was raised in upstate New York. As a professional, he settled in Portland, Oregon, where he created and ran a social service agency for the larger community of Portland. His work around cultural competence was started because of the fact that the models they were using in cross-cultural communities didn't work with all communities equitably. And so at a meeting with the National Institute of Mental Health, they complained the fact that the models at that time didn't work, and were challenged by the directors at that time to go out and develop a model that did work. And so over the next couple of years, he and colleagues from across the United States, and I understand from Canada, started putting together a cross-cultural program that would work. And out of this came a systematic cross-cultural competency program. We discovered, Ray and Kakanza each separately discovered the first manuscript. We took a look at it and said, this is exactly what we needed. So we approached him and asked him what he would charge us to take his product and turn it into an education represented model. And I still remember his words to this point. He says, just do no harm. And so it's with that we present with you the work of Terry Cross through the lens of education. In this next slide, what you'll see are a number of people who are the co-authors on the variety of books that we have, the 14 titles at this point. As Delores and I walk through this seminar with you, we will use the pronoun we an awful lot today. We want you to recognize the fact that we is a large community of people. And so this becomes an important part, that as you hear our voices, you're actually hearing the voices of about 25 people.
On the next slide, you'll see a book by Margaret Wheatley. The title of this book is Turning to One Another, Simple Conversations to Restore Hope to the Future. Those of you who know Margaret Wheatley, you know that she's a systems thinker. She's a scientist, and she's written extensively on systems as organizations as systems, and how organizations function. And she wrote this book shortly after September the 11th, 2001. Her fear that as a nation and as people, we would become so afraid of each other because of the terrorist attacks in the United States that we would just turn away from each other. We would just be so afraid of each other. We would fragment ourselves in fear. And so she wrote this little book called Turning to One Another. And she said that sometimes we go to conferences and we attend seminars just for what we as individuals can get out of it. And she said we need to really focus on conversation, and in communities, focus on conversation. So when Randy and I and others as cultural proficiency consultants and educators start our seminars, we always look to Margaret Wheatley's work. And I'm just going to read a little bit from her work today, just to set the tone for our webinar. She says that for conversation to take us to a deeper realm, she believes we have to start with some basic principles. She says that when we are together, we realize how wise we can be together rather than thinking as individuals. She says that we acknowledge one another as equals. We try to stay curious about each other. We recognize that we need each other's help to become better listeners. We slow down so that we have time to think and reflect. We remember that conversation is the natural way that humans think together, and we expect it to be messy at times. So we're going to take you into a little bit of that messiness now with Mitch's help. This is an activity that we do with our groups just to help us get acquainted with each other, and then we'll debrief this activity with you in just a few minutes. So as a participant today, we're going to ask you to engage in this activity with us. It's called What's in a Name? I'm going to model this activity. We ask participants to engage with 2 or 3 other participants with the activity. Somebody that you might know well. Today it's going to be people across the webinar, people you may have never met before. And you're going to share your complete name, your preferred name, who gave you your name, and how you experience your name, and how you think others might experience your name. So I'm going to model activity, and then Mitch is going to tell us how you might find a person in the room and pair up with that person and talk about your name story. So I have 5 names. My name is Delores, Faye, Broom, Harp, Lindsey. Now, Delores is spelled D-E-L-O-R-E-S. And I know there's a Latina spelling, D-O-L-O-R-E-S. And I also know that Delores is a African-American female name, usually in the South. Now, those of you that cannot see us today, I'll just identify myself as a white woman. And so sometimes when people see my name first and they do not see me, they're not sure who they're going to meet when we actually meet. Am I Latina? Am I African American? They can usually tell if they hear me speak that I'm Southern, and so they're really not sure who they're going to meet. I'm very proud of my name because my mother gave me my name, and it was actually her name. So very proud of my name. I've always gone by the name Delores, no shortened form of it, no DD or D, just the name Delores, and very proud of it. The name Faye, F-A-Y-E, my mom gave me that name as well because it was her best friend at the time I was born. So I was named for my mom's BFF, if they had such a thing then. And then my last name, Harp, H-A-R-P, was the name of my former husband, and it's still an important name in my life because it's the name of the 2 children that we have. And then, I skipped a name, didn't I? Broom, B-R-O-O-M, my father's name. So a very important name, a family name for me. And then I told you about the name Harp, and then my last name, Lindsey. And if you do not know, Randy and I are not only co-authors, we cohabitate here in this home in San Marcos, and we're very good friends and lovers and husband and wife. So that's my last name. So it's interesting, the last 3 names that I have, Broom, Harp, and Lindsey, it will indicate the influence of the men in my life, my father's name and my former husband and Randy Lindsey. So those of us women sometimes take on the names of the fathers in our lives, and then the names of our husbands. So that's my name story. And Mitch, if you can suggest ways that folks can connect with each other, and for just about 4 or 5 minutes, share their name stories with each other. Can you help us out here?
Okay, so this is a time to share, and I think your name is an important part of each of our culture and who we are. So if you have a webcam and if you have a microphone, click on the avatar of another person and the story of what's your complete name, what do you prefer to be called, who gave you your name, how do you get your names, how do you experience your name, and how do you think others experience your name. I have 6:52 on my computer, so at 6:55 I think we're going to be coming back, and so you got 3 minutes, and I'll pull myself down and give you a chance. If you don't have a webcam, put that information into the IM and share it to with the other people in your room, and we'll be back in a minute. Okay, let me bring back the Lindseys. And hi. Okay, so as people are doing this, what do they learn from sharing their name story? Can you hear me?
One of the things one of the reasons we do, yes, the reasons that we engage folks in this activity is the obvious, so they get to know each other. But this really brings culture into the room long before we start talking about diversity or race or ethnicity or gender. It really brings culture in the room. It brings everybody in the room. So if we're working with 50 people in the room or 500 people in the room, everybody has a chance to speak and everybody has a chance to be heard. There's no right answer, wrong answer. It's a name story, so it's personalized. And then we ask people to talk about what it felt like to share their name story. And we ask folks to talk about what it felt like to hear someone else's name story. So in some cases, it's a very emotional time for people to connect with their culture, with their history. We have folks talk about being adopted and an important moment for them to share their, maybe not knowing much about their history, talking about foster care students. Mm-hmm. So it's wide open for everyone to participate in this activity. So it really brings everyone into the room. And it's one of those how-tos that we talked about. It's how do you bring culture in the room and engage folks early on in any of the sessions to talk about self and to engage in others, because cultural proficiency is about who I am. It's the inside out approach. Who am I in relation to others? So we get started with this activity, bringing this forward really early in the workshops and in the sessions.
To apologize to all of the people. I actually came up a little bit early, and Jamie Bisa, or I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, called me on that, and it's my fault.
It is. So. It's a very rich activity, and we usually give people 7 or 8 minutes, and then have to expand it a little bit in our sessions because people really want to hear other people's stories. And we've had people say, I'll be back in a minute. I'm going to call my mom. I want to know more about my story. Sometimes it can be folks will say, I thought I knew everybody in the room. If we work with an intact group, a faculty or a leadership team, and they'll say, I thought I knew everybody in the room. And here I realize I didn't really know the significance of my colleagues' names and the cultural connection that the names would have.
And I'm thinking that for teachers in their classroom, or for principals or administrators in their schools, starting off the year doing something like this kind of creates a culture within the classroom or a culture within the school, correct?
I can build on that. All three activities that we're doing today are in the Manual for School Leaders, which they're in lesson plan format. And the important thing about the work of cultural proficiency is it does not require a consultant to do the work. All the books are written in such a way that you can actually pick them up.
What are we going to do?
It still creates a lot of opportunities. We came up with a new acronym you may have heard of called NCLB, No Consultant Left Behind. But what we find is that the work of diversity, the work of anti-racism, the work of equity is a very challenging conversation for a lot of people. So the first two activities, the one we just modeled and the one we're going to describe next, are sort of having the conversation, to have conversation before you have the deeper conversation. And so it's really important.
And I'll bring myself down so you can move on to it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So this slide coming up really talks about what you can do within your own school, within your own group. Select some of the cultural proficiency books that really meets your needs. All of our consulting, while we're talking about consulting, is really custom design based on the needs of the school, the community, the district. The books are written so that they're in a journal format. There's content, and then there are journal reflection questions, and there are sections that we call going deeper. You can engage with your colleagues in a book study. There are book study guides with the books, and then there are dialogic activities where you can engage with your colleagues. Even in the reflection questions are there, and also in an inquiry. Kind of an action research model to focus on the equity approach to access and achievement disparities. And the way that you do this, of course, it would be using the 4 tools of cultural proficiency, and that's what we're going to introduce to you now. These are 4 unique tools. We usually start with the barriers, though there's no particular order to them, but most folks confront barriers in doing the work of equity and access. We address 4 particular barriers, and then to counter those barriers, we introduce to you then the guiding principles. The guiding principles are a set of core values, and without these core values, you're going to have a pretty difficult time implementing culturally proficient practices. So these are the underlying values. And then the third tool that we will introduce to you today is called the Continuum. And the Continuum is really the language for describing a healthy organization or a not so healthy organization, and a productive organization or a not so productive organization through the policies and practices that we would examine. And then the fourth tool would be the real how-tos, the real action verbs of what it is you're doing aligned with what you say you're doing. And these would be the essential elements for culturally competent behavior. So these are the 4 tools, and we'll go over each of them just very briefly today. But if we were with your school or your district, this would be the work over, in some cases, 2 days to get into the tools. And then as the school or the district does their work, this is over 2 to 3 years as the work unfolds into the action steps and action planning that you would be doing.
So the next slide, we introduce a series of questions, and these are the key questions of the work of cultural competence and cultural proficiency. If you notice there, they use the same 4 tools of cultural proficiency. But as you pick up a book and use it, or as you work with your colleagues, or as you have external people work with your school, these are the questions we think that are really significant to be building into a professional learning activity. And one is to take a look at, and we always talk about cultural proficiency at multiple levels. There's myself as the educator, there's my school or my school district, there's also the larger system. And so it's always the inside out. I'm taking a look at my behavior. I'm also taking a look at my school and my school district. So taking a look, what are the barriers that exist within our school that create disproportionality or that support disproportionality, or support access and opportunity gaps or achievement gaps. Then we take a look at what our stated mission and vision and core values are, and to what extent do they align around closing those kinds of gaps that we've been able to document in our society. Third, and this is the point we're going to spend some time with in a couple of minutes, is what are the unhealthy and healthy behaviors, the language, the behaviors, the policies and practices that exist within our school. And then once we've identified and had those kind of conversations, and what standards do we have to measure our progress and to really initiate action within a school? And then, of course, the last one is the qualitative one, and that is, to what extent are we satisfied with student learning outcomes? As Mitch mentioned in the beginning, I've been in this business for quite a while, and it's refreshing to finally find on our desktops, we're actually talking about student achievement across racial and ethnic groups. We've been dodging the bullet for several generations in our country, and starting with No Child Left Behind, one of the silver linings of No Child Left Behind is he made the achievement gap public. And so in this last part of my career, it's refreshing to see that fifth question is one that's really driving a lot of professional learning conversations in our schools, in our universities. So the next slide, we will start and get into the tools of cultural proficiency.
Well, describing what cultural proficiency is, we've talked about it as that inside-out approach, and it's about being aware of who we are, how we work with individuals in our schools, and how we respond to people who are different from who we are. It's about visible differences and even the differences that we cannot see, and preparing our students to live in that world of difference. And then going on to the slide, we're going to move along pretty quickly here. If you go to the slide, Mitch, that shows the magnifying glass. Yes, sometimes people say, well, we don't have time to do one other thing. We are overworked and overloaded. And so we describe that cultural proficiency is not a thing that you add on. It's the lens through which you do your current work. So if you could just imagine that magnifying glass, or the set of glasses like these I'm wearing that I keep seeing the reflection of the window in over there. But it's the lens through which you examine everything you're doing. So your school site plan, your discipline plan, your resource plan, everything that you're doing, you put on the lens of cultural proficiency and ask, is this a culturally proficient school-wide plan? Is this a culturally proficient discipline plan? So it's the lens through which, and you use those 4 tools to examine everything else that you're doing. So that's why we present to you these 4 tools, learning them. Now, of course, you learn the vocabulary, you learn the common terms, and then you're able then to do the work that you're doing using these 4 tools.
So let's take a look at the 4 tools. We're going to describe 3 of them and actually have you engage with one of them. Oh, I got ahead of myself.
Yes, yeah, we want to do this other activity, or describe this activity anyway. The cultural perceptions. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the things in the books that we describe often is the skill of reflection and dialogue. And we take time for people to reflect on their own thinking and talk with each other. Reflection is the conversation that you have with self, and it takes time. You have to set aside time to do it, and it's your thinking about your own thinking, the metacognition that takes place. And then dialogue is a skill to be developed. It's not just sitting around talking. It's engaging in conversation towards shared understanding. It's not about making decisions. It's about reaching shared understanding. If we're talking about state standards, if we're talking about kinds of instructional strategies, are we talking a common language? Do we have the same thing in mind when we describe English learning students, or students learning an additional language? When we talk about students being underperforming, whose responsibility is that? So we can talk about those things in dialogue session. So they really take a skillful discussion guided by skillful facilitators. And these are fundamentals to probing, understanding in our organizations about our policies and practices, especially around issues of equity and access and opportunity gaps.
So each of the books is structured to facilitate and foster reflection and dialogue. So I'm going to describe an activity now. I wish we had time to actually do it with you. It's a high energy activity. It builds on the first activity. If you've read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blank, then you'll understand this activity quite readily. What you do is you pair people up, it could be standing or seated, and they actually follow this protocol. One person is A and one person is B, and I always start with B just to make it fun. And on the next slide, there are 7 prompts. And the way that there you go. So I asked the B person to describe how they think the A person would respond if the A person could talk. But the A person is to take on the attitude of the Sphinx. They're to say nothing. They're to sit there and give no feedback. And it's really challenging to watch them do that. But they go through it in about 2 minutes. And then the person sort of unfreezes, gives correct answers. Then they switch roles. And then the A person describes the B person while the B person is taking on the role of the Sphinx. What you ask people to do at the end of that is talk about what did it feel like to be in that role of the describer. And what you get are people that are experiencing a little bit of anxiety, didn't want to stereotype, didn't want to judge, and it makes for a rich conversation. And even though people don't want to stereotype and don't want to judge, when they take a look at their thought patterns, they in fact have done that. So we try to identify the fact that assumptions are natural and normal. And probably the most important part of the inside-out process of cultural efficiency is beginning to understand one's own assumptions. Because once we understand our assumptions, then we start taking a look at our own behavior. And the inside-out process of cultural efficiency is not so much about learning about the cultures of other kids or other communities, all of which is very important. But the context that we take it is, how do you respond and what are your assumptions about that student, about that culture, about that kind of a dynamic that might be in your classroom, in your community. The assumption part is very important because that's the individual part. Once people get into the work of cultural efficiency, then you also have to take a look, what are the assumptions built into policies and practices? Because all policies and practices are built on some assumptions, usually the previous generation. What we uncover in schools that we have worked with, particularly if they have changing demographics, is very often the assumptions that guide our curriculum and instruction patterns are built on the assumptions of a previous demographic group of students. And once people make that connection, it becomes a real healthy conversation. So these first 2 activities, What's in a Name and Cultural Perceptions, are a really efficient way of people coming together in community to take and understand that everyone has culture. All of us who come into the community have culture, and we all have assumptions. At this point, then, we can actually begin talking about in depth the tools of cultural efficiency. We might spend a couple of hours at this point going with these 2 activities and debriefing them, but it creates a nice community, and at which point then we can systematically talk about the 4 tools. So with that, we're going to start that process. And the barriers to cultural efficiency are the most complex of the 4 tools. And when I'm doing the training, I always start with these tools. And I always start this way, and if we had time, I would engage you in that kind of activity. I ask people in the group to raise your hands if you think that somewhere in the history of the United States, racism existed. And people look at me like I've lost my mind, and they giggle. I say to me, has in the past? I say, okay, has. And so I answer the question, so they do. And I said, how many think that the system of racism has tentacles into today? Everyone says they do. Then I ask the same question about sexism. Then I ask the same question about the social class distinctions. Then I ask the same question about heterosexism. And by this point, you've introduced 4 really important concepts. And then the point that we try to elicit from the group is, if we can, as educated peoples in this room, agree that the isms have existed historically and still persist, then we also have to understand that some people lost rights and privileges because of those systems, of those oppressive systems. If people lose rights and privileges, they accrue to other people in ways other people may not even see. And that's the way to introduce the concept of presumption of entitlement and privilege. And one of the illustrations I would use is that if we took all of the men in the room and all the women in the room and denied women the right to vote on what time we're going to have lunch, the men's vote would be more powerful, or any combination that you want. But the important thing is to take a look at the fact that if the isms have existed and persist in our society, then we also have to take a look at the fact that some people benefit in ways they may not even understand and know. Once you've set that stage, then we can move to really understanding that there's resistance to change, and understanding that this work of diversity is not about making the students change, or it's not about making the community change to us, but how do we adapt to the community in ways that really serves them. And we, at this point, they'll start treating their cultures as assets rather than deficits. So once we've had that conversation and done some reading and some reflecting and having deep conversations, then we're ready to really start taking a look at the tools of cultural proficiency. And this is significant because it engages people in gathering data. And so we're going to walk you through that real quickly.
Once we've okay, go ahead, Randy.
There's a wonderful video. I know you have access to TED, Technology, Entertainment, and Design, TED.com. This 17-minute video by Jackson Katz is absolutely spellbinding in being able to unpack the isms and privilege entitlement. And he's a former Marine. He's a video maker. The film that this one is from, it's on TED, it's easy to access, is about gender violence. And I take the first 5 minutes and use that to introduce the concept of privilege entitlement. And trust me, if you go on and download it and take a look at it, if you've not seen it before, it'll be quite enlightening and really a good tool in your toolbox.
So the next slide is really how do you counter the barriers, and you counter the barriers with the 9 guiding principles. And we're going to just put the 9 up real quickly so you can see them. There's 5 on this slide, I think, and then 4. And we don't have time today to go into each one of these, but in our workshops we would. These are the core values of cultural proficiency, and they're everything from recognizing that culture is a predominant force in our lives. We cannot not have culture. It's everything that we do. And in organizations, it's how we know how decisions are made. It's how we know what's going on around here. Culture is how we identify with our groups. It's how we respect the unique cultural needs of our individuals and group identities. And then if you go on to the next slide, we see there are 4 others. And it's really about understanding the best of all worlds, our own cultural needs as well as the cultural needs of others. And certainly when we are in schools and we bring together multiple cultures all in the same environment, it's about a high value that we hold for the different cultural groups. And really the fact that overcoming the barrier of unawareness of the need to adapt is certainly adapting to the fact that parents have to be bicultural in nature. They have their own home culture, and then they have to know the culture of the school system. So as Randy said, it's the culture of the school that needs to be adapting to our community rather than asking the community to adapt to the schools. So using these 9 guiding principles help counter then those barriers. And then we come to the third tool, which is the continuum. And we're just going to have to move through what the points on the continuum are just to acquaint you with it. There are 3 points that are negative, and there are 3 points that are positive on the left side of the continuum.
I can build on that. The first 3 that are in red are informed by the barriers, and the 3 that are in green are informed by the guiding principles. And that becomes an important part of it, because the next activity, which we're going to show you quickly, is one that's in the book. It's in lesson plan format, but we actually gather data from the participants, and then we can group them into these 2 categories. And it really becomes instructive to take a look at the climate in the school or school district.
So if you can imagine a room, any room, training room. So on a wall, we put up 6 large poster papers going from left to right. So on the far left side, we have cultural destructiveness. So Mitch, we're going to go through the next 6 slides pretty quickly. So cultural destructiveness on the left side. And we ask folks to write on small Post-its examples of what they might see or hear or programs that they would know about. And then we, within their own organization, by the employees, not students or parents, unless the parents are employees in that organization. And then we give examples that you see here on the slide and others, actual things we've heard or seen in districts where we've worked. And then folks write their examples on a Post-it. And then at the end of the activity, they come up and put their Post-its on those 6 large poster papers. So cultural destructiveness is the most hostile and the most negative. You hear these kinds of quotes. Then incapacity is next. It's about dismissing or blaming and just putting folks aside and not accounting for them and their cultural needs. And then cultural blindness is the next one, and it's really about pretending or not see or unable to see culture. It's kind of like, let's just all get along. What's wrong with the way we're doing things right now, and treating folks just alike, and really not seeing culture, really just being invisible to cultural needs. Randy, you want to pick it up there?
Yes, now we move to the constructive side, this pre-competence, and having people gather data here also, things people have said, things people have done, policies and practices. This is the pre-competence, beginning to know what we don't know, becomes a really important part of the data collection. The next one is cultural competence. This is actually things that are happening in the school, things that are observable, that are constructive, that are positive. And then cultural proficiency is what they call the advocacy, it's future focus. What becomes significant now at this point, we have everybody come up and put their Post-its on those 6 sheets. And our experience is that they tend to be tipped to the negative more than the positive. And irrespective of what the distribution is, you get a representation across the 6 points of the continuum. It becomes a really important activity because it's a climate profile for the school. And by the way, we also ask people on the left side, any illustration you have there is not to put the speaker's name. Anything on the right side, it's okay to do that. But at this point now, we have a real good attention to what the profile of the school is, and are able then to move into a consideration of the essential elements as planning guides for how they move constructively in the future direction.
So once we've collected the data around that tool, we use the activity then to move into the 4th tool, which are the 5 essential elements. And this is really the action phase of the 4 tools. These are the 5 essential elements. If you notice, they all start with verbs: assessing cultural knowledge, valuing diversity, managing the dynamics of difference, adapting to diversity, and institutionalizing cultural knowledge. We're going to show you how these action verbs actually fit on the rubric. When you registered, you were sent by email a rubric, one of the rubrics from one of the books. There are rubrics in several of the books. This one happens to be the curriculum instruction rubric. And the rubrics are like roadmaps that will guide you in developing action toward the right side of the continuum. And one of the things we want to caution you about the rubrics in our books, they're not developmental in the sense of you want to start on the far left side and move along. You don't want to go from cultural destructiveness to cultural incapacity to cultural blindness. You want to leapfrog. If you're on the left side of the continuum, you want to really leap way over to the right side. So Mitch, on that next slide, you actually see the rubric here, and what you see on the left side will be the 5 essential elements. You see 2 of them here. And then if you move toward the right side in the shaded area, you'll see that that's where the essential element is actually in operation or in action under cultural competence.
Yeah, one point that I'll make with your rubric, if after this webinar you take a look at the rubric and it makes sense to you and you take it back to your school tomorrow, let me talk about the inappropriate use of the rubric and the appropriate use of the rubric. The inappropriate use of the rubric is you go back to your school tomorrow and talk to someone at the school, and you find something under cultural destructiveness is where they are. And so you go up to that person and say, I was with Delores and Randy Lindsey last night, and I learned this rubric around cultural proficiency, and it seems to me that you're culturally destructive. That's the inappropriate use of the rubric. The appropriate use of the rubric is if you see a behavior from a colleague or yourself, then look to the right for behaviors that are appropriate to moving forward. And so that's really the purpose of the rubric, is to see current behavior and then see behavior that's more appropriate, pre-competent, competent, and proficient. And the right-hand side of the rubric is, in fact, developmental. The left-hand side is, of course, not. But we've had great success with this as people being able to take this work and go deeply with it. I will point out the left-hand side, if you can see there, is informed by the barriers. The right-hand side is informed by the guiding principles. We've not been in a school yet where people don't have a core value for all students learning. And so how do you build on that in such a way that we change the conversation from all students learning to all educators educating? And that's really the shift in conversation that we're trying to generate with schools we're working with, and finding in professional learning settings, people are quite amenable to that and quite supportive of that, if not, in fact, already there.
Other shifts that we see in our work is that people move from the left side of the continuum by talking about subgroups. Now, that is a typical term used in assessment, but we invite folks to, rather than describe students as subgroups, talk about them as student groups or demographic groups, and that moves you to the right side of the continuum. Instead of talking about students as being underperforming students, talk about them toward the right side of the continuum as being students that are underserved or need to be served differently. So typically what we see from the post-its on the activity earlier using the continuum is that we see blaming students and their parents and their communities on the left side to a shift toward us, we taking responsibility on the right side of the continuum. We can and we will toward the right side of the continuum. And so what we want to see on the next slide. Okay. Well,
yeah, I'm sorry. I was going to ask you a question about that, because this seems to be a real crux. I think it's something that could really benefit, everybody. So let's say that that you observed me, and let's say I'm a teacher in one of the schools, and you observe me, and you're a teacher in one of the schools, and I go up to a person and I say, you're an Asian, so you should really be good in math. I'm disappointed in you. Okay, and then I walk away. Okay, so that seems to me to be on that left side. Okay, I mean, it's kind of so what you don't say to me, hey, that's what do you say to me under those circumstances?
Depends on how well I know you.
Well, okay, so you're a teacher with me, and we work together.
Yeah, I think it's really important in that kind of situation is if the person said that to me or I said that to that person.
Well, you observed me
saying
that to one of the students.
Yeah.
Okay, and now you're not going to say, hey, something I was with Randall and Delores Lindsey last night, and they told me that's really culturally destructive behavior, and that was really bad, and you have to change. That's not what you would say. Yeah. So what would you say?
I would. In fact, I've had that happen most recently last week. Only it wasn't Asian and white. It was gay lesbian. And in my setting with this person, it was in elementary school, and I said, "Don't you realize that that's stereotypic?" And the person looked at me and was quite surprised. It's one thing to try to gauge. Anytime you confront a behavior like that, expect that a person is going to be taken off guard for a minute, and explain why I thought it was stereotypic in this particular case. And the person was upset because they saw a lesbian teacher had her wife's photograph on her desk. I thought it was inappropriate. And so we had a real interesting conversation for about 30, 35 minutes. And, I'm not sure that the behavior is going to change real quickly, but at least the behavior was challenged. And that becomes a really important part of the conversation. What I tried to do was not make judgment, other than the fact that, obviously I was thinking the behavior is inappropriate, but not to shut down, and get into a downward spiral of blaming, but just entered into conversation so we can continue the conversation. When I go back in 2 weeks, it'll be interesting, because I'll seek him out to continue the conversation. It becomes very, very important. And that's why we start those first activities of having conversation and developing community before we get into these kind of conversations. That's a great illustration of that.
Okay. Now, I know we're coming up to the hour. Also, I'll bring myself down, and I'll bring the slides up and let you proceed. But I thought that was a segue, because you brought up what people not to say.
And using the 5 essential elements really help shape what we call what do you say when, and using leverage points. These are the real how-tos. What have we done or not done to cause the patterns that persist? How can we recognize what is going on in order to effectively intervene? These are questions you ask about what is it we need to do and where do we need to enter the system. What is it that we can continue to think about, and what are beliefs that allow the results to persist? So it's breaking up those continuing patterns that persist. The next slide that we have is really about culturally proficient practices and how they focus on it's really the moral purpose of the work and focusing on closing the achievement gaps, and it takes a critical mass of folks doing that. And we would advocate for using the 4 tools of cultural proficiency as one approach. It's not the only approach, but it's the approach that we use. We're going to close our part of it, Mitch, and then turn it back over to you. Just Margaret Wheatley's words again, because when communities come together to do this work of equity and access and really believing that we can educate all students, it makes for a pretty powerful work in the community. And this is what she says about that. There's no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Ask what's possible rather than asking what's wrong. Notice what you care about and assume that many others share your dreams. Be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. Talk to people you know, talk to people you don't know, and talk to people you never talk to. Be intrigued by the differences that you hear and expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty. Invite in everyone who cares to work on what's possible. Acknowledge that everyone is an expert about some things, and know that creative solutions come from new connections. Remember, you don't fear people whose story you know. Real listening always brings people closer together, and trust that meaningful conversation can change your world. Rely on human goodness and stay together. We want to thank you very much for everyone joining us today, and Mitch is going to share with you some other ways that Corwin can support your learning.
Well, and thank you, Randy and Delores, and thank everyone for joining us today. You know, this is the whole issue of cultural proficiency. It is a voyage, and even though I myself have been very interested in cultural proficiency for probably 20, 25 years, you know, every time I hear something, I learn, and this really helped me with a few things that I've been working on for myself. So thank you, and thank everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us today. If you're interested in let me go to the correct slide. If you're interested in beginning or continuing your work in cultural proficiency with Randy and Delores, there are several ways that you can do that. They and their co-authors have been developing an entire body of PD work focused on cultural proficiency through Corwin over the last 20 years. And one place to start is with the Cultural Proficiency line of books, which focuses on professional learning for teachers, school leaders, administrators, and support staff. There are over a dozen cultural proficiency books available on a variety of topics, ranging from English language learners, coaching, culturally proficient leadership, using PLCs to advance cultural proficiency, Common Core, and more. You can get any of these books through Corwin.com, and they're also available as ebooks through the Amazon Kindle store, iTunes, and ebooks.com. So in addition to the books, there are also 4 online professional development courses available through Corwin. For those of you who'd like more flexibility or multimedia-based learning, these e-courses come in 30-hour and 5-hour formats, depending on how deep of a dive you'd like into each topic. The e-courses include videos, reading excerpts, and practice exercises to guide you and your team through each module. If you'd like to enroll your entire staff or enroll your leadership teams from different buildings in your district, you can get discounts through Corwin. just tell them Mitch sent you. Actually, you don't have to tell them that. They give you the discount anyhow. And then for author consulting, Randy and Delores have also partnered with Corwin to develop a multi-year implementation program to support cultural proficiency in schools and districts. And it's not just the culture, the cultural proficiency is as important as it is. Just keep in mind that it also improves your outcomes because it has a dramatic effect on student learning and also the satisfaction of everybody in the school and district. They and their team of co-authors and colleagues can work with your staff one-on-one to build your organization's internal capacity. And this fully customizable program can help support and sustain your current equity work for lasting change. You can contact Corwin if you want more information or for a customized proposal. And then finally, you can join fellow educators from across the country who are focused on cultural proficiency at this year's International Cultural Proficiency Institute. Keynote speakers include Trudy Arriaga, Raymond Terrell, Gail Thompson, and Kikanza Nuri Robbins. Corwin has arranged for an exclusive discount for today's webinar attendees with the promo code APRILWEBINAR. And if you go to www.corwin.com/2001CPI, you can get more information, and don't forget that discount code, which is APRILWEBINAR. And then coming up from Corwin on April 19th, there's Visible Learning for Literacy with Douglas Fisher and Nancy Frey. And then on May 9th is Lynn Sharrett and B. Planche with Leading Collaborative Learning. So I know I mentioned earlier that I got a lot out of this webinar. I hope everybody else did. It's such an important topic, and most of us don't even realize the cultural blinders that we all have. The work that Lindsay and Delores Randall and Delores are doing is it is so critical for all of us moving forward. So it's 5 minutes past the time we were supposed to end. Please feel free to contact us at EdChat Interactive or the team at Corwin, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions. If you have questions, we'll archive this webinar, and we'll also be sending you the slides. I'll be signing off. This is Mitch Weisberg from EdChat Interactive, and I really hope that I get to see you at a future event. Good evening.